to another Friday morning coaching stream. I am Matt Hunt once again, and this is the 5th week of our 5-week block. So we are going to be kind of recapping today a lot of what we've already looked at. We're going to be looking at some of the different scenarios that we've covered over the past month or so with some trainer spots, and just talking a little bit about some of the principles, some of the most important aspects of these scenarios that we've got to keep in mind when we're playing some of these very dynamic board textures, since that's been our focus so far. We're going to move into a new block of challenges next week. So we're going to be starting with a new topic. But for now, we're going to continue just finishing out this one and giving you guys a bit of a recap and a summary of some of the principles here. Hey Stella, welcome. Thank you for being here. Glad to hear that you're able to catch this one. So thank you for taking part. I'm going to load up a trainer exercise. We're going to go create drill. We're going to go post flop. We're going to keep it at, what stack size do we want? Let's go 60 big blinds, because I think that's usually a good stack size to study for chip EV stuff. We're going to go board configuration, two-tone or rainbow. And we're going to go, oops, that is not what I wanted. It's gone back to surprise me. Rainbow or two-tone, there we go. We're going to go 3 to a straight. And that's going to be fine for now. Then what we're going to do is hit play for both selected positions. And we are going to be, what position do we want to be in? I think we want to just be in any position, really. I think we're going to go for a variety of different spots here, play for both selected positions. We just want to kind of be dealt a ton of different scenarios here. So we're going to look at every board that has 3 to a straight, a lot of two-tone, a lot of rainbow, and we're going to see how this kind of comes up for us. We're not going to worry too much about the portion of our range that we're going to have, because we want to talk about the ranges as a whole and how those are going to function on these different board textures. So we're going to hit save and train, and we're going to dive right in. Now, one thing I have been doing recently is actually using a Google Chrome extension that hides our hole cards. So, or that sort of allows to blur a portion of the screen. So that is an interesting thing that you can play around with if you're doing your own drills, just to test yourself on what kind of strategy you think is going to be applicable for a specific spot. I think that's a really useful little trick or a useful little tool. So we're not going to do that right now, but we may do that in future for some sessions. So let's think about our first spot. We've got small blind versus low jack at 60 big blinds, single raise pot. So small blind against low jack, we're going to have some pretty condensed ranges. Low jack is obviously going to be uncapped. Small blind is going to have a lot of pocket pairs pre-flop. They're also going to have a decent chunk of Broadway hands. Board is jack 9-7. Now these middle card boards are quite tricky. They are ones that I think a lot of players maybe get wrong, and I think a lot comes down to the fact that the preflop caller is quite pocket pair heavy here, which means that we, as the small blind, we simply have a lot of pocket sixes and below. So we have a lot of hands that have to check fold a lot, and that kind of puts us in a position of not really being able to do much leading, I wouldn't think. So I think we're just going to check everything here. We do face a bet, and we have 5 high, no backdoor. Well, we have backdoor flush draw, but we have no backdoor straight draw. Can't imagine we can continue here, so this is just going to be a clear check fold. In terms of our overall strategy, we do have a reasonable chunk of check raises here, since we do obviously have sets and 2 pairs in our range. So not really too controversial of an approach there. It is interesting, though, that against this small size, we do actually have to defend our underpairs at some frequency there. So that's quite interesting. But generally a pretty straightforward one to start off with there. And if you guys do have questions, if you have any kind of comments, do feel free to chime in the chat. And of course, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Always helps the channel out. So our next spot, we get button versus low jack. So again, we're at 60 big blinds, This time we're still in a single raise pot, but we are the in position caller. And our board is 6-5-3 with 2 diamonds. Now, we do actually face a large c-bet here. We face the B66 size. I would expect that this is not a super common size on this board. I would think that the size that we imagine, or the size that I would imagine happens here more frequently. Actually, let me rephrase. I would imagine this is a very high frequency check board. So it's not so much that this is a size that we're not going to see very often. It's that I don't think we're going to see a lot of betting here in general. When we do see a bet, it's probably going to come from a somewhat polar range, which means that we are unlikely to have too many raises, and we're probably just going to do well by calling with a hand like sevens here. Yeah, there we go. Almost no raising, pretty much zero right there. We basically just play call or fold. We're calling with a lot of strong hands with a single diamond. We're calling with all of our pairs, of course. So relatively straightforward as a spot right there. Now, by the way, guys, if there's any complications with the audio, anything not coming through super clearly, just let me know and I will do my best to correct it. Always want to make sure that you guys can hear me clearly and that I have my mic set up kind of in the right area for these streams. So do let me know if there's any issues there. Our next spot, we have the same, well, sorry, not the same situation. We're literally in the same hand. We're following the trajectory here. We're on the turn. We face this big turn bet, and on a double flush draw board like this, these large turn bets are actually quite common, just because there's a lot of medium equity hands present in our range, and a lot of the value range from villain here is going to want to try to target a lot of those flush draw hands that we have. So I don't think I'm surprised to see this size. I do think it's likely to come from a somewhat polar range, except obviously with a lot of the bluffs having pretty good equity in this situation. So they're going to have some draws, they're going to have some gut shots, flush draws, etc. I don't think we have any reason to raise here, and I certainly don't think we can fold when we have a gut shot ourselves. In fact, we have a double gutter ourselves. So I'm just going to hit the call button once again. We are just pure calling with this hand, as you can see. We do have some hands that raise, just not this specific hand. Pocket sevens is right in that calling territory there. Although what is interesting is that we actually do fold pocket eights quite a lot. That is a little surprising, but probably would be to do with the fact that eights maybe is going to block some of the bluffs from their range. Could be the reason. Nevertheless, we do call with sevens, very reasonable call. And then the low jack actually shoves the river on a diamond, and now I think our hand is probably just a fold. I don't think that this hand is going to function particularly well as a bluff catcher here, considering that we don't have a diamond in our hand. So we're just going to fold it. And we did fine. So in terms of general principles there, I think a good starting point for thinking about the way that this board played out, we did see on the flop, like I said, very low frequency bet from villain here. It's like almost a range check, but we did see a bet. And when that bet does come in here, there's actually very little reason for us to raise as the in-position player. And it's because of the polarization that exists in that betting range. So I think a good takeaway here is that you certainly don't have to do a lot of raising on these boards from in position. It's not mandatory by any means to just kind of raise and get it in on the flop. When you're in position on these boards, you actually have plenty of opportunity to call and navigate multiple streets, especially given that you have the positional advantage over the villain here. So quite a natural play here to just do a lot of calling, and certainly not one where we have to do a bunch of raising. So let's move on to our next one. Now this time we are in the under the gun 7 versus big blind formation. So we are the pre-flop raiser here. big blind calls, and we get this 9-6-5 with 2 spades. Now, this is going to be a board texture where, as the under the gun raiser, we obviously have all the overpairs in our range, and at least a pretty good chunk of them are going to have a solid incentive to bet here. We also have a backdoor flush draw, and we have a high card, low card hand, and generally speaking, a pretty good rule of thumb for in position C bets is that high card, low card hands are usually going to be pretty decent betting candidates, because you're going to have the ability to fold out some hands that are actually ahead of you right now, and you're also going to have live cards or a live overcard that's a pretty clean out. So for example here, if we bet this flop, particularly for the larger size, if we bet the 4.6 here, which I think is the size that I'm probably erring towards going with, I would say ace 4 of hearts is probably a pretty good candidate for it, because of the fact that we have the ability to get hands like potentially ace 10 of clubs, stuff like that to fold. Hands that don't have even a backdoor, hands that have a better ace high but do not have a gut shot or a flush draw or anything like that. So I'm going to go with this larger bet, and it looks like it's pretty good, although it is a mix. So not a pure bet by any means, but you can see there ace 4, ace 3, ace deuce suited. Those are slightly more common bets than some of the other ace hands, so kind of makes sense what I was saying there, or how I was applying it. And you can see that this is a board where we're not betting that often, but if we do bet, we're going to bet on the larger side. So pretty logical right there, and overall I think we did okay with that one. So this spot now, we have low jack versus high jack. So this one is single raise pot once again. So naturally, this is going to be a board texture where, as the pre-flop raiser, we're obviously going to have a lot of very strong hands here. The caller can also have some of those strong hands, but not at a super high frequency. And the caller in particular is quite heavy on undercards and underpairs, which is a good thing for us here. However, we do have a hand that is blocking some of those underpairs. We're blocking pocket fives and we're blocking pocket sixes. So the question becomes, is this hand the kind of hand that benefits from potentially getting other hands to fold? And I think we have enough blocking power over the nines, or sorry, enough unblocking over the 9s, 8s, 7s, 4s, 3s, deuces, that I think we can still bet. I'm going to go small bet here, and it is small bet, high frequency. So question in the chat, how do you choose to bet or check when both options are good? That's a really good question, and for the most part, there are 2 ways that you can go about this. I think you can simply randomize, so you can pick a randomizer, something like the tournament clock, or the arrangement of chips in your stack, the seat that you're in at the table, various things like that, the suit of your hand, all sorts of things that you can use to actually randomize your decision according to 50-50, 75-25, whatever you choose to go with there. Or you can make your decisions according to the factors that you think are going to potentially shift you more in one direction or the other. So for example, if you think that your opponent is going to make more mistakes after you bet than they are after you check, so for example, they're going to fold too much on later streets after you bet, they're going to not raise you enough, they're going to just play too passively, all these things, they can shift you towards betting. And something like they're playing too passively versus a check, or they are even playing too aggressively versus a check in some cases, those factors can also shift you in favor of a check. But ultimately, I think those situations where both options are fine, it's quite important not to go too far down the rabbit hole of trying to come up with a train of logic that tells you this play is definitively better or that play is definitively better. Because if the EVs are close together, then that simply is the reality of the situation in a lot of spots. And it's more important to focus your energy on the situations maybe on the later streets or in other scenarios where the EVs are further apart. So randomizing is a completely reasonable alternative. Obviously, if you're up against really good players, randomizing is advisable. If you're up against weaker players, maybe it isn't as necessary, but it's also not super easy to always identify what the best option is. But I wouldn't get yourself caught up in all kinds of, tied up in knots, trying to figure out the best option when it ultimately is just fine to do either one, right? So hopefully that answers the question. Now we did bet the flop in this scenario and we get called. So reasonable spot for us. We do have a hand that, as you can see, is betting the flop at a reasonable rate. And then we turn a flush draw. So now turning a flush draw on a card that is essentially a brick here. It's not really changing the board at all. It does bring a flush draw out there, but that doesn't really affect things because a flush draw is just a draw. So I think in terms of our range, we're probably going to go with some big bets here. I would expect to see maybe a lot of the larger bet sizes, the 8 or the 12.7 here. So probably going to go with a somewhat polarized approach. But since we are out of position, we want our bluffs to have some degree of equity here. And that, I think, means that a hand like this that has that flush draw is probably going to be a pretty reasonable bluff candidate. So I'm going to hit the 8 big blinds here. We're going to go with a bet, and let's see how we did. It's taking its time to tell us. Okay, so we did do okay, but in fact this hand prefers the overbet. So we went a little bit small on the turn here. If we are going to bet this hand, we have some hands that are betting small, so a little bit of thin value type stuff, and then we have a lot of the big bet also being used. So the 75 looks like it was maybe a bit of a hedge on my part. Kind of went too far in the medium territory. Didn't really go as big as we potentially could have there. So interesting to see that the bigger bet was slightly better there. We do get called and we get to this brick river. Having a missed flush draw is not ideal here because obviously we are, theoretically we're blocking some of the missed draws. But when you think about types of hands that our opponent can actually have here, after calling that large bet on the turn, they don't really have a lot of hands that include the 5 or the 6 of clubs. So really our hand here is not really blocking or unblocking anything ultimately. So I think that it might not be a bad candidate for just going for a river bluff here. And considering the river is a complete brick, it would not shock me at all if we are using some of the all-in size. So we're going to hit the all-in and see what it says. All-in is good. Okay, so we're actually, it's a mix. It's very close. We are only doing a small amount of all-in here. We're mostly using the 75% size, but 6-5 of clubs is a hand that is occasionally bluffing for the all-in size. So not an unreasonable approach here, not an unreasonable bet on the river, and we did okay. So I think we did all right overall there, and I think the main takeaway from this one would be on a triple Broadway board like this, even though it's more connected and it's more dynamic, it is actually, or even though it's more connected and it feels somewhat dynamic, it's not as dynamic as it seems because in fact there are a lot of turn cards like this one that are bricks, and a lot of river cards that are bricks. Any run out that features 2 cards below a 10 here, 9-5 or 3-7 or whatever, any of those runouts are actually pretty much brick runouts. So we do have to prepare ourselves for that on a board like this, even though the flop seems like it's fairly dynamic. So that's an interesting one right there. Now our next one, once again, another single raise pot scenario, and we have a button flat from ourselves, and oh, sorry, it's not a single raise pot scenario. It's a 3-bet pot scenario. I just realized. We are button versus cutoff at 60 big blinds, 3-bet pot. There's 16.9 big blinds in the pot, so it definitely is a 3-bet pot. And we have the 8-9 of spades, which is going to be a somewhat low frequency 3-bet to begin with. And then we face this donk bet on the flop. We face a lead from the cutoff, which is not going to be super high frequency, but it will exist on boards like this where the cutoff has all three of the sets. So we have to consider at this fairly low SPR, what kind of strategy are we going to have? I do think that we're going to have some hands that want to raise here. We've only got a small raise size, or well, we've only got one raise size. I wouldn't say it's that small. It's about 20 big blinds or so. But when the when we're thinking about what hands want to raise or what hands want to get all in here, I think a lot of our overpairs are going to want to raise. Maybe not all of them. We're also going to have, obviously, some bluffs, and that's probably going to be some hands that contain a diamond. But I don't think a hand like 8-9 is a particularly great raising candidate because it's hard to imagine getting a ton of action from a lot of hands that we're dominating. And it's also hard to imagine ever getting anything to fold that's better. So we're just going to hit the call. Oh, wow. Okay, so this is actually a reasonably high frequency raise. I'm a little surprised by that. If we were to, let's look at the full sim here. I want to take a quick look. So we're mostly raising with a range of overpairs. You can see here, overpair, tens, jacks, nines, queens, stuff like that. And some top pair. And you can see it's like king 8 with no backdoor, 9-8 with no backdoor, ace-8 off if we have it here. So that's a surprising kind of an outcome there. There's small fractions of some bluffs here, but I guess it is a little better to raise 9-8 than I thought. And I would expect, if we can look at what our opponent's response is, yeah, okay, so I kind of see now why it's doing this. The response is that if we go to ignore weight, you can see our opponent here is supposed to be jamming versus our raise with a lot of stuff like 7-6, 8-7, even king 7 with a draw there. There's a lot of jamming going on with hands that are losing to 8-9, and that's going to contribute to why a hand like 8-9 is just going to be happy to raise and then call it off here. So quite an interesting one. Not an easy one to find in practice, but it is one that's in there. Now we did call, which is also fine. Naturally going to be a reasonable option. And then we see this diamond turn and the cutoff checks. Now, something that we have to be aware of here on any kind of dynamic board texture is that when the draw is complete on the turn, naturally that's going to mean that both players are going to have the completed draw at some frequency in the majority of cases, particularly when it's flush draws, because it's very uncommon or virtually unheard of for there to be a situation where somehow only one of the two players can have the flush draw. Most of the time, both players can have the flush draw on the flop at some rate. So when the flush gets there, both players can have the flush at some rate. And based on that, on this particular turn, we're not really going to see tons of aggression from the cutoff. We're also not really going to see tons of aggression from ourselves. In particular, I think we're now in a situation where, having just called the flop with 9-8 of spades, it seems unlikely that there's a lot of reason for us to bet here. We're probably not going to be in a position of being able to get a ton of value from a hand like 9-8 of spades. So I would think checking seems better here. Oh, okay. So we are actually doing a surprising amount of betting. We do have some checking in there, so it is kind of close, but a surprising amount of the small bet here, the B25 size. I would imagine that's just going to be a product of the fact that the cutoff is checking with slightly fewer flushes. They're going to have a little bit less in the way of flush combos when they do actually check. So that's kind of interesting. Maybe a little bit surprising to see so much betting from the 8-9 here, but it does make sense. It's logical. And then we see a king on the river and the cutoff checks. Now, this king on the river is a reasonably inconsequential card in the sense that It doesn't change the nuts at all, doesn't really change the board much. But nevertheless, it is a card that after the turn goes check, check, we would expect the cutoff to bet at a pretty decent rate here if they did have, you know, these potential hands that river top pair and so on. So I think we're actually at a point now where a hand like 9-8 is relatively strong. I think that it's going to be pretty reasonable for us to consider betting here. So I would say, I think the 21 size feels pretty good. Let's go with that. Oh, mistake. Okay, 2% mistake. The fact that this is a 2% mistake indicates to me that this might actually be more of a check. So let's hit check. Yeah, okay. So it is actually pure check. I was a little bit ambitious going with a bet here. Let's take a look at our betting strategy. We have, again, this is with the weight of the hands being ignored here. So let's, you know, what I like to do with the sim readouts here is to define the value range by doing this. And as you can see, value range here, it's top pair 57%. So when we happen to river a king, we're betting a lot. When we have an overpair like aces, we're actually not really betting, which is quite interesting. Two pair, set, and flush. So essentially, we're just not strong enough to bet here on the river. We basically have to have a king plus. And then if we were to reset the zoom here and go with some of the bluff combos or try to figure out what our bluffs are going to look like, it's going to be right here, basically everything below this point. You can see that it's essentially anytime we get here with queen high or worse, we basically just bluff, right? Like this is actually quite simple. Ace 9 is your tiny frequency of bluffs there if we specifically have the 9 of diamonds and not the ace of clubs, which is like kind of an obscure thing that we don't have to worry about. And then, you know, everything that is queen high or worse is just auto bluffing here. So we do have obviously a good chunk of bluffs because we have to have bluffs, but I think the missing ingredient here really is just that the 8x hands don't really want to bet. Eric, welcome. Thanks for being here. Watch me for 5 minutes, hit the like, and convince myself I studied poker. That's great. We like that approach. You know, we like when you hit the like button. We like when you tune in. It helps the channel. And hopefully you pick up something in this next 5 minutes. So, let's move on to our next one. This one is, once again, a 3-bet pot. This time it is low jack versus under the gun 7. We are the low jack here, so we're the 3-better once again. And in this case, we have the ace king, and once again, we're facing a donk bet here. So low card board texture. This is probably not one where villain has all 3 sets, considering that villain probably doesn't ever have pocket 3s pre-flop. But it is still a board that is quite good for villain's range and not that great for our range, especially in a tight formation like this. I would not expect that we can justify just folding ace king here. But I don't think we're ever really going to raise, so we're just going to hit call. Yeah, so ace, oh wow, ace king is actually mixing here. Ace king off is a mix. That's very, very surprising. We are raising a lot of those jacks, queens, jacks, 10s, even kings as well. A lot of those vulnerable overpairs. But interestingly, ace king is a low frequency continue, probably just because we don't have that backdoor, so we don't really have too much route to improving our hand. Now we do face another donk bet on the turn, or at least I wouldn't call this a donk bet considering, you know, they are the aggressor at this point. They bet the previous street. So I would probably say this is just a bet, but I don't think we can continue here. Generally, if a hand is towards the bottom of our range on the previous street and it doesn't improve, you know, most of the time that just is going to mean that we fold it. Yeah, I mean, it's 9% continue with ace king high here, so more than I thought, but still very reasonable to just fold. Okay, so this one is a very interesting one. This is blind against blind, limp check. So this is totally different to the spots that we've seen so far, right? And now we have to evaluate and consider how this type of board texture is going to affect the ranges when we're in a limp check spot. In a limp check spot, both players have relatively wide and slightly more capped pre-flop ranges. but the big blind especially is more capped than the small blind. However, on a board like this, the big blind is now going to have quite a few hands that interact with this board on the lower end, considering that a lot of those offsuit hands that are checking back pre-flop are going to be able to make some top pairs, some middle pairs, some bottom pairs on this board texture. So I would expect this to be a decently good board for the big blind here. But as far as whether we have any real incentive to bet with ace deuce high, I don't think we do. And the reason is simply that I would never expect a better ace high to fold, but I don't think we ever really get called by hands that we're substantially ahead of either. And that's going to mean basically any kind of king deuce or worse. Like, those are the only hands here that are substantially losing to ace deuce. So I think we're just going to hit the check, and you can see right there is 92% check. Surprised to see a little bit of betting there. That almost might be, I guess, kind of a value bet, if anything. But we do check. And then we face this 2/3-ish kind of bet on the turn, 2.3 into 3. I would say here that I think it's quite common for players to look at this and say, well, I checked back ace high, turn was a brick, I can't really fold. And there's a lot of spots where there's merit to that. There's a lot of spots where that is going to serve you very well. But there's also spots where it's surprisingly tricky. And I have a feeling this might be a spot where our hand is not quite as good as it intuitively seems like it could be. I am going to call, but I would not be shocked at all if it tells me to fold. Wow, huge blunder right there. So right away, I think we were pretty accurate saying that we should fold. Wow, that is a 10% blunder. That's not quite the biggest blunder I've made in these sessions, but it's one of them. That is certainly a huge blunder, and yeah, I mean, it's a little surprising to see that it was that big of an error. If we look at what our turn strategy is here, as far as continuing against this 75% bet, you know, it's kind of funny because we are continuing some ace highs here, but the ace highs are the ones that have some kind of a gut shot, and even though we are continuing with some, you know, stuff like king 10 high that has the gut shot as well, we are actually folding a 3 sometimes here, right? That's kind of the interesting thing about this, that we're folding a 6 sometimes, we're folding a 3 quite a lot of the time. So it's just a situation where the strength of the hand that we need to continue here against a 2/3 or a 3/4 pot bet on the turn is actually surprisingly high. We need a surprisingly strong hand to continue that. You called it Hostito. Yeah, I mean, I kind of called it. I hit the call button, so I still blundered, but I kind of called it. Raise because we don't like George's face. No, we don't want to raise that particular candidate. We're going to raise with a variety of hands here, but ace deuce off is not a good one. In terms of how that raising range is going to be constructed, if we ignore the weight here, it'll give us a little bit more of a sense of where it's coming from. You can sort of see that the portion at the top of range that is going to raise here, if we look at the top sort of quarter of the range, you've got a lot of like ace 8, you've got a lot of your pair plus gut shot like 8-5, pocket 6s, 10-9, 10-8, like a lot of stuff that either has the straight or interacts with the straight in some way. Surprising amount of 8 deuce off there, which is interesting. If we do just call the flop with 8 deuce off, we can raise now. We've got some stuff like the 5-4, we've got some 2 pairs, so essentially not a particularly unintuitive bluff raising range, value raising range. In terms of the bluff raising range, let's isolate everything kind of from here down. Bluff raising range, we kind of got like some 9 deuce, 10-5, a lot of 9x, a lot of 10x, some 5x. 10-5 is kind of a nice one, 9-4, 9 deuce. Yeah, just a lot of straight draws, really. The bulk of it, or the highest frequency part of it, is going to be kind of around here. If I just focus in on that area, yeah, I mean, it's just a lot of 9x and 5x, really. Kind of a good way to approach it. So not really any need to go with any kind of raising with a hand like ace deuce there. So next spot, this is also blind against blind, except this is now small blind raise, we call in the big blind. So we're getting a nice eclectic mixture of hands today, mixture of situations. And in this case, small blind opening, we flat with jack nine off, very reasonable. And now small blind is going to come with a small bet on this board. And I think players get a bit turned around when they face small bets on these boards because they have this connotation in their minds of dynamic board or wet board or something means bigger bet. And then when they face a small bet, they're like, oh, what's going on here? It really comes down to equity more so than draws. You know, you want to think about the fact that the small blind's range here is going to have a lot of medium to high equity hands on this board, and even a hand like a strong jack here in their range is going to be plenty strong enough to put some money in for value. So they're going to have a pretty strong range advantage here. They're going to have a lot more of an advantage at the bottom end of the ranges, and that's going to allow them to just do a fair amount more small betting. When we have jack nine, this is right in the territory where I would be really surprised if we ever raise, because we're unlikely to ever get any calls from worse, but we're also pretty much never going to get any folds from better. So I think we're just going to hit the call button, and we do call. Yeah, it's 97% call there, so tiny frequency of raise. Now we get a brick turn, and we face the pot size bet. So we face the very large polar size. I do think that on these brick turns, our defense becomes a little bit more straightforward in the sense that hands that have pair plus gut shot just become fairly trivial continues. They become fairly comfortable hands to continue with that will allow us to just realize our equity in position, and hopefully villain checks river and we just win. So I think we're just going to call. And yeah, we're just playing call or fold here. We're not going to have any raises at all. And sorry, need to hydrate. And when we have this specific hand, we are not going to have any reason to fold. We're not going to have any reason to raise, obviously. So we're just going to play call. Now the river is a jack, so we actually improve on the river. It is noteworthy here that, you know, we have to look at this as, even though our hand improved, it didn't necessarily improve to be better than a bluff catcher, because we probably aren't really up against a worse value hand here much. I think there might be the occasional overpair, the occasional ace-queen type hand that can go thin for value here, but I would not expect us to be facing a lot of that stuff, considering that the jack is quite a bad card for villain in general and quite a good card for us. So overall, I would imagine that we still are in a position where we probably are not beating much value, if any. But as far as bluff catchers go, our hand is a very good one, because we are blocking the straight, which is very helpful. We're obviously blocking full houses. We are blocking a jack, which is also a helpful thing. You know, we are making it pretty unlikely that villain has something like ace jack that was going thin on the turn. So I don't think it's ever realistically possible to fold. But let's take a look at our overall strategy here and how tight we're going to be in this spot, because I think it might surprise a couple of people. Let's see. So we're obviously never folding a jack, but there are quite a few queens that fold. If we look at the top pair region, even a hand like queen 10 with a straight blocker is a mix here. Queen 9 is a mix. Queen 8, which had two pair and now got counterfeited, that's also a mix, right? So a queen is a bluff catcher. Ace queen and king queen are basically pure calls, which implies that there is some portion of queen X that's going for value on this river. Let's see where villain's at. Villain's value range is, that's not, the filter's not really working, so we'll get rid of that. Let's just isolate this. Villain's value range here is, okay, so they are jamming aces and kings, which is, again, not great for when we have a queen. They're jamming, they still have some ace-jack and king-jack in there. They actually don't really have ace-queen and king-queen in there. I would think maybe the reason why we're still calling with ace-queen and king-queen ourselves is because we block the aces and kings. So, yeah, they really are not jamming that much in the way of worse value. In fact, I think the major deciding factor here is that even though they're not jamming worse value, the overwhelming the overwhelming majority of their jamming range is overpairs and straights. So those pocket aces and pocket kings are really, really common here as part of their jamming range. So that is really interesting. Now, as far as our bluff catchers, you know, we are calling with the ace queen and king queen, like we said. We're never folding a jack, and we are occasionally calling with like some very sketchy kind of 8x type hands, but those are very low frequency. Those are really just the absolute, you know, bottom of the barrel bluff catchers here. Even like ace 9 with ace high, that's very ambitious here, but we do technically beat bluffs there, so that's kind of interesting. So ultimately, you know, completely fine call with Jack 9 there, so nothing really too much to say about that one. Okay, we get now a under the gun 7 versus big blind spot, and this is one where I think people are once again going to slightly underestimate how much equity our range has here when we are the pre-flop raiser and we are on a board like this, because again, big blind has a lot of undercards, a lot of underpairs. We have a lot of Broadway hands that have pretty robust equity here. So I would think that this is probably a decently high frequency betting spot for us, and I think betting small is going to go okay here. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. It's actually a range bet. So high frequency small bet with some big bet as well. So definitely not as scary of a board as people think. Definitely not a board that is bad for our range. And there's a big, big difference between like Jack 10-7 with a flush draw and, you know, 8-7-5 with a flush draw. Those are two dramatically different types of situations. Now, we do bet small with this particular hand. Turn is the 10 of diamonds. So turn actually does improve villain at a decent rate here. But the key thing is, because we actually were range betting the flop, the turn also improves us. The turn also allows us to have trips at a decent rate here. So that makes it a spot where villain probably doesn't get to do that much donk betting. As far as our individual hand goes, ace king off is probably pretty unlikely to be able to get too many better hands to fold if we bluff here, and pretty naturally difficult to get value from worse. So I think we're just going to be squarely in that check region. Wow. Oh, wow. Okay. That is really interesting. So we actually are bluffing. We're bluffing more often than I thought with ace king here. Let's see why that is. So ace king off, kind of mixing, you know, all the combos of ace king, pretty much mixing bets and checks here. So checking is fine, but it is doing more betting than I thought. And let's investigate why. So B75, if we use the bet 75, what's folding? I see. Okay, so we use the B75. Villain is supposed to fold a 7 quite a lot. That actually makes sense. I didn't really consider just how much 7x villain does have here that, excuse me, that cannot continue against that size. So it does make sense that ace king would benefit from folding out those hands. There's also underpairs there. And there's also kind of an interesting phenomenon here with some of the flush draws, because if you look, there is some nut flush draw stuff that's actually calling. So in a weird way, this is kind of a merge spot, because ace king offsuit with no club here has the ability to sometimes get a 7 to fold while also getting called by a flush draw. So that is actually one of the factors that's contributing to some incentive to bet there. But we do come with the check, and then villain goes big on the river, and we actually river an ace here, but the flush gets there. So this is a great example of how we might approach a spot where a bunch of draws complete. We also have a decently good hand, so how do we approach it? Well, the starting point is we have to establish what the value bet threshold is for our opponent. So what are the hands where if they got to this point with those hands, they could value bet for this size? I think for this spot, clearly full houses can bet this big. Flushes can probably bet this big as well. I do think it's a little bit tricky to bet this size with a 10 here, unless they specifically have a 10 with a club. And I think it's also pretty tricky to bet this size with a straight, unless they have a club. So probably going to be a position where I would be surprised if ace-king is ever beating any value here. So immediately we establish that our hand is just a bluff catcher. And then we have to establish, is it a good bluff catcher or not? And in this case, when we're bluff catching, or in any case when we're bluff catching, we want to be blocking value and unblocking bluffs. And in this spot, in terms of blocking value, well, we don't have a club in our hand, so that's not good. We don't have any kind of a significant blocker over a 10. Like if we had a 10, we would be blocking full houses or blocking 10x, but we don't have that. And in terms of unblocking, well, we are unblocking a few of the 8x, 9x hands, but we're also blocking a few of them as well. You know, stuff like king 9 of spades, you know, king 8 of spades. We're blocking those hands. So there's definitely some bad properties to our hand as well, even though we did improve on this river. And I think if we had a club in our hand, if we had ace-king with the king of clubs, I'd be more inclined to call, but I think our hand at this point probably just functions as a fold. Okay, so it's a mix. A little bit more close than I was thinking here. A little bit more of a okay bluff catcher than I perhaps expected. Let's just wait until it loads it up. Yeah, we are mixing. We're mixing ace-king and ace-queen. Presumably just too high up in our range to some degree. But as far as villain's value range goes here for the B150 size on the river, you can kind of see here that it's pretty much going to be beginning at this point right here. So it's basically just flushes, pretty high frequency of flushes and then some bluffs. So they aren't really betting a 10 for this size very much at all. They are betting a couple of full houses here, but the full houses actually have enough blockers that, maybe they can't even really bet those hands for this size. So very interesting spot. And, in terms of our response, we do pretty much have raises with only full houses for value. In this particular case, facing an overbet. If you look at the stuff that's raising, there is some king 8, king 6, queen jack of clubs there that's able to jam for value, but when we jam, we have a full house 81% of the time as far as the value range. Ace-king off with a club. Is ace-king off with a club pure call? Let me test that out for you, sports fan. Ace-king off with a club. Pretty much, although sometimes it's bluff jamming. So having that king of clubs blocker is powerful enough that jamming is actually kind of good as a bluff. Particularly because we also block ace-10. So that's a pretty interesting one. But yeah, ace-king off with a club, we're pretty much mostly calling. Without a club, we're a lot less willing to do it, and we're certainly not going to jam without a club. It's also worth noting that hands like ace-jack are actually jamming quite a lot, and again, that is because we're blocking full houses. That's not going to be a value jam. If we look at what villain does after we jam against this B150, villain is folding a lot of trips, and villain is folding all their straights and about half of their flushes. So villain has to fold a flush quite a lot to our jam here, which is exactly why we're jamming stuff like ace jack as a bluff. So that's a really interesting kind of a discovery at the end there. We are jamming those full house blocker type hands as bluffs here. And I think that's actually a really good spot to wrap it up on for today. So we went through a bunch of different types of situations on these dynamic boards. We got to about 45 minutes, so we're gonna call it a day right there. Hopefully you guys got a ton out of these last few weeks of studying these dynamic board textures. We're gonna go into a new block of challenges for starting with this coming week. I have picked the topic, but I am not going to reveal it yet for you guys, so you'll have to tune in on our Discord on Monday to find out what the topic for the challenges for the coming weeks is going to be. Until then, I will see you guys soon. Thank you, everybody. Good luck this weekend. Go crush those tournaments, and I will see you all next time. Thank you.